My deep appreciation of theater history was instilled in me by Tom Empey, a college mentor to me and hundreds of others. While teaching Greek theater terms, he would grab the fabric of his slacks and say, "You see these pants? Euripides Eumenides," making light of content that could be considered rather dry and stuffy while still maintaining respect for the art, which is what I want to do with this podcast. For each episode, I invite a guest from the many paths my theater career has taken me down. I give my guest no idea what we'll be talking about, but they know we're going to find an outrageous story about theater history and perhaps get a better understanding about why we're still doing it after all these years. So welcome to Euripides Eumenides, and I am your host, Aaron Odom.
Apocalypse, apocalypse, I said, why you wanna show up now? Just when the heart of my life was getting good. I'll give you one more chance. Walk on out of the door, yeah. Get your ass to getting where the getting is good.
Hello again, my friends and listeners. This is Aaron Odom from Trident Theater in Sheridan, Wyoming, coming to you with another episode of Euripides Eumenides, a theater history podcast. Welcome back, or for those of you just joining us, welcome for the first time. Here we are, beginning year 3 of Euripides Eumenides, and I've got a lot planned for the future. When I first started this podcast and consulted a lot of people I trust in the performing arts industry about starting a theater history podcast with the format I had in mind, I got a pretty frequent question. Do you think you'll be able to find enough topics to talk about? Turns out, yes, I can. Actually, when I started, I began making a short list just to keep me motivated. A Word document, double-spaced, one topic per line. And when I started, I had maybe about 16 topics that came to mind immediately. Well, obviously, here we are starting the third year of this show, and I'm on episode 54. Granted, many of those have been 2-part episodes, so one topic per 2-part episode, but I'm finding no shortage of things to talk about. And plus, I keep finding new stuff. I mean, who would have thought that I could have talked at length on episode 52 about the life and stories of Calamity Jane and how that could have made us ponder the nature of theater in the first place? And that Word document I mentioned, I'm on page 4, and only 2 of the pages have topics I've already covered. So there are even some of the original topics I came up with that I have not even started to peel the onion on. Now, that said, if you have any ideas for future topics, I'm all ears. Write me at trident@tridenttheater.com or go to tridenttheater.com and find the Contact Us form, or hit me up on my social media. I'll talk about those later in the show. Now, as I've done with my last few episodes, I want to shout out where I'm seeing new listeners. So, what's up, Austria? Oh, hey, Austria. If you haven't checked out my episode 19 on Rebecca the Musical, you gave us that lovely little piece. And as we find out in the episode coming up, we may actually see it come to fruition in English-speaking markets in the near future. Here's some that I didn't see coming. Hello, Switzerland and Singapore. Nice to have you with us. And I'm going to shoot in the dark here, but it looks like Toronto is enjoying the show, or at least many listeners in Ontario find their way here. As always, if any of you would like me to get a live in-person episode near you someday, just let me know. So, all that aside, let's get to today's episode. I have been very fortunate with this show that I've been able to make some fantastic acquaintances with people in the industry because they've heard this show and they want to contribute. One such person is the outstanding London-based theater producer Richard Jordan. Not only is he a producer, but a recurring columnist for the theater magazine The Stage, and has long graced his readers with his extensive theater wisdom. And when I first met Richard, I knew exactly how he could contribute. Richard has been in the producing game for a long time, and I would say knows what it takes to make a show both financially and artistically successful. So whenever I have Richard on the show, I do what I like to call a post-mortem. For those of you unfamiliar with that term, that is the meeting that is held once a production is done to determine the strengths and areas of improvement for a production team going forward. He and I have done a couple of these before, and what happens is I pick a show from theater history to determine why it was so successful when it might not have been, or why it didn't go as well as hoped. I got a great one for him today. K-Pop the Musical, which very briefly saw its day on Broadway in November and December 2022. And Richard and I managed to talk about this for 2 hours, but I've condensed it to the best I can for you today, so you're getting the best parts. And I was super lucky to get him because he was in kind of a major project at home, and he's headed out to Australia, and he'll probably be there when this episode drops. So just consider yourself fortunate we got him for this episode. And speaking of this episode, let's get right to it. The Post-Mortem of K-Pop the Musical. Okay, so man, I'm so glad I got you between your departure to Australia to open a new show and your current project of helping your mentor, Michael Codron, who was involved with so many amazing things in theater, but he is retiring in his 90s, as one does. But Richard, you said you have been involved in like being kind of the archivist because you have libraries and museums who are saying they're all full of things, so they can't take them. But you ended up getting a really cool couple things from this office.
Yeah, I think I've sort of in a way I suppose I've become an adopted unofficial archivist. I mean, Michael is a really successful theatre producer. So I've had a very nice time of sort of trying to help, and a sad time because there's been a lot of history there because I used to work for Michael at his offices. But there's been myself and some of his colleagues sort of just trying to sort of help tidy up some of the things that are there and bits and pieces, and we've all been given and bequeathed a few bits and artifacts of his career. One of the things I've been fortunate enough to be given is the chair that he sat on through a lot of his career, which will not mean a lot to a lot of people, but of course it's the chair that I used to always sit in every day. He was sitting in whenever I would go in and have a meeting or a discussion with him, and it's the chair where I think quite a lot of the elbows on it are very worn down because I think there was a lot of elbow leaning as he was reading many of those great plays that subsequently went on to being produced, and of course those things like those chairs, those little artifacts that they mean so much, I think, to the people who've had those connections if you are involved with or you're immersed in it. It doesn't necessarily mean so much to somebody else, but they're important connections. They're sort of sometimes that one step removed. I always think that like when you go to the British Library and you can see things that maybe Shakespeare signed or something like that on display. It's that one step.
As you mentioned, it was very sentimental to you, but I mean, when you look back and think of it, Michael Codron discovered some of the biggest names in the latter half of the 20th century in the UK. I mean, Harold Pinter.
I mean, Michael's writers that come out through that period. I mean, let's just think about some. So Harold Pinter. So Michael produced, The Caretaker and The Birthday Party. Birthday Party, of course, was a famous flop when it first got put on stage.
Of course it was, yeah.
I think it ran for something like 5 performances at the Lyric Hammersmith. So when we're talking, it really was a sizable flop. And then, so we've got Alan Bennett, Tom Stoppard, Michael Frayn. Of course, he produced the great production of Noises Off, which was one of his big successes. You're talking about a canon of writers that go right the way through in a way to some of the West End plays of more latter writers such as Patrick Marber and
Closer. Yep.
So he's got a very, very good eye for plays, and really he's the man who taught me how to be a theatre producer. I was very fortunate to work for Michael, and then he became consultant and mentor in my company when I started, and he really taught me about the art of reading a play. I mean, Michael's great skill was he used to read the first 25 pages of everything that he got sent him, which is exactly the same as I do. By 25 pages if you're hooked, and if you're hooked, you're going to carry on reading it. If you're not, you're probably going to know it's maybe not the show for you. But the important thing about that is it's a very personal thing, the connection you make with the play.
Well, yeah.
So I might be looking for something, but let's say I read those first 25 pages. The play is maybe not quite great, but what an amazing new voice. And you maybe say, this isn't the play I want to do, but I need to maybe build a connection with that writer or that composer or something to start to see where something might develop and where something comes out of it. And the most important thing always, I think, in producing is that art of being able to read a play. And I'm actually amazed often at how many producers or how many even sometimes artistic directors can't actually read play. They have put on as a reading. and everything becomes this sort of strange situation where you go in and everyone's doing a play reading, and you sit there and you listen to it, and maybe you're lucky because you've got a couple of big major stars doing the reading, and then the managements of the landlords of the theatre say, well, this is great, but if I don't know, these two major film stars want to do the play, we'll give you a theatre, but you're not actually assessing it always in the way that you should do. And actually, I think the art of being able to read a play, the skill in it, is actually an incredibly important craft for learning. I think if anyone's listening who wants to work in theatre, or wants to be a producer, or wants to be in really anything in the theatre in terms of how it works, understanding how plays work and understanding how to read a play is actually one of the really biggest skills, I suppose, in wanting to work in this industry, and actually reading lots of plays. I mean, I didn't come from a theatre family, and I grew up in a very rural part of the UK where theatre wasn't the most accessible. We were very lucky that we had a really great local regional theatre called the Norwich Theatre Royal. But I learned my plays from going every Saturday morning to the library opposite it and reading plays that were at the Norwich Library. And basically that gave me the creative foundation of my creative life. I think I probably drove the librarians crazy, because as I got more and more interested, I go and say, give me everything you've got on, I don't know, Polish theatre. Give me everything you've got on, Harold Pinter. And so, of course, I'd be having these books. But actually, when I look back at it, it was incredibly formulative to me, because it taught me I like lots of different things. This is, to me, I mean, on a separate but brief tangent, is what annoys me a lot about the world of Spotify and things we do now.
Oh, yeah.
Which is that often when you meet drama students, they come with a certain song to perform.
Yeah.
But they haven't listened to the whole arc of how that album works.
Yes.
Which is actually a digital and Spotify album in your nature. When you listen to a lot of albums, like pop albums, if you listen to someone like, I don't know, David Bowie, or you listen to a lot of those great recording artists, their albums are constructed in a certain way, so they project a trajectory of journey when you go through the album listening to it. But now we live in actually an ecology, because of Spotify, where certain songs just get lifted and you download maybe one song you like, but you don't see by the whole album.
Right. There's an algorithm that pairs you to a song. Yeah. And
it's the same with cabaret. It's the same with musicals. You actually have to listen to sometimes you need to listen to the entire album to understand how does this frame together. So if you just come in and, I don't know, perform Memory from Cats and in an audition, you need to really understand what you're singing and how does that show joy, and how does it correlate, and how does it make sense. And to me, it's an enormous bugbear. But I mean, again, it's like plays. It's understanding how something works, and going out and finding things out, and not recognizing that just everything on Wikipedia is not necessarily the fact. Sometimes going to your library or going to find things out is actually part of the excitement and enjoyment of better life in the theatre.
Well, Richard, that's a wonderful place to jump off for the topic we're
going to jump off a cliff and see where we land, Aaron. Are we again? I'm looking forward to it.
I was kind of going, okay, we're talking about Michael Codron and going into semi-retirement, and I mean, no disrespect to Michael, but kind of like out with the old, in with the new. You're going to know.
He always said a life in the theatre is all about what you're doing next. Another golden rule for theatre.
Well, I'm going to start with a bit of a quote. It is probably, as I like to do, I start with something of a question, but it is a quote from a review of a recent musical. Like I said, you're going to know exactly what we're going to be talking about right away. Here we go. Quote. So just how do you define the phenomenon known as K-pop?
Okay.
Or, for that matter, the new multi-stranded, multi-chambered, immersive performance piece called K-pop, which occupies 2 floors of a building in Hell's Kitchen, end quote. So how do you define K-pop?
Well, I think it is what it is, probably. I mean, there's a certain audience that's going to pick up on a show like that, just as they have done over the years of other shows. But it didn't last very long, did it, I think?
No. And that is exactly what we're going to talk about today. We are going to do a bit of a postmortem on K-pop, the musical.
So was it a show before its time?
Oh.
Or was it just a dud show? There's your question.
I'm going to do this. I'm going to tell you a bit of the history of it, but your experience in the business might offer a lot of ideas as to why it only enjoyed literally 17 performances on Broadway.
It was at which theater? Was it Circle in the Square, wasn't it, if I'm correct?
It was at Circle in the Square, yep.
Wasn't the biggest flop at Circle in the Square. The biggest flop at Circle in the Square was a musical called Glory Days.
Oh, really?
Glory Days opening closed on its opening night. It's about 2009, 2010. Now, I'll just say, because it's an interesting point, because we'll come back, because there is a link here possibly to K-pop.
Yeah.
Glory Days was a show that began in Washington and transferred in. And it was a disaster, although they did release a cast album of it. Roll On, it's been widely and actively produced in quite a lot of other theaters and places all over the country.
Right.
All over the world, actually, including in South Korea, where they've just had quite a successful project. Because it's a bit of a boy band sort of musical. And so, it's interesting that here's a huge flop, and it was a gargantuan flop, but actually, strangely, has found a life and a legacy, much in the way that Carrie has done. If you talk to young students now, people are absolutely obsessed with Carrie. I mean, Riverdale, gave it its own episode. Although, in fairness to Glory Days, and I suspect K-pop, Carrie is actually a superior score that just had the wrong production and the wrong treatment to it, and actually, it's been quite good to go back and rediscover.
Well, I don't know. There's going to be a lot we're going to talk about with this one, and I just, when you go back and look at something, you're like, oh, you could have turned left here when you turned right. It's just something that, where did this just dysfunction? Okay. So the words that I quoted just a moment ago, those are the words that opened famous New York Times critic Ben Brantley's review of a theatrical experience in 2017, simply known as K-pop. As Brantley suggests, the piece is meant to be both unique to the individual audience member, and it all centers around the musical genre of South Korean pop music, better known as K-pop, which has become a global phenomenon. So, before I get into the actual experience, we have to have something of a general understanding of K-pop as a genre, because for those of us who don't have any idea about it, this might have been another problem of its inception on Broadway. But this is my brief history of K-pop to the best of my understanding, and this is one of those things where I'm just going to invite people to send me hate mail and tell me that I was completely wrong, because I have a feeling I'm going to gloss over things. And to those of you who are going to write me, I won't go into the major players of K-pop, because it's kind of like any sport. You have your favorites, and they are decidedly your favorites, and you can't be dissuaded otherwise. So I'm not even going to try. But from what I understand, just about any of those major players have contributed to the evolution of the genre in diverse and similar ways. The common thread is that all K-pop artists come from a very meticulous system of music production that is meant to be a method of producing the perfect pop sound and songs that fit their exact moment in time, using tools from almost every popular music genre: synth pop, electronica, hip hop, metal, dance music, etc., etc., etc. So anything that's popular, put it in the blender, we have K-pop.
That's quite a good analogy, I think, of it. It is a genre that isn't really like any other when you sit down and
no.
And some of it's quite enjoyable, but some of it's very, very bizarre.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And I mean, I've been to South Korea a couple of times with different productions, and I love South Korea. I think it's a fantastic, fantastic country to visit. But it is also quite a baffling place when you're there as well. And and just the high tech style of it all. I mean, I think South Korea, if I remember, I think has more television channels than anywhere else in the world. And when I was there, it was a few years ago, one of the biggest shows that was on South Korean TV was a guy who sort of sat wearing a sort of rather weird military hat, sort of like in a sort of funky outfit, and cooked his dinner and ate his dinner talking to the television, and people all over South Korea, this was his show at 6 o'clock in the evening, and people all over South Korea cooked their meals and ate their tea watching this guy eating his tea. And that was basically the nature of the show. He bought his own channel, and this show was absolutely colossal in South Korea, certainly at the time when I was out there. So it's a little weird. K-pop's the thing, really, but it's a bit like Marmite. You're either going to love it or you hate it.
Yeah. Okay, so getting back to a history of this. Since South Korea revised its democratic government in 1987 and gradually became a society that honored self-expression, like you were saying, with the ubiquity of television channels, K-pop has been something of a method for South Korea to strategically place itself as a relevant player in world culture with music. And this music is very carefully crafted. Like I was kind of hinting earlier, as though it's assembled in a lab, K-pop has somewhat scientifically identified all of the elements of what is considered cool and modern in the current time. And I'm probably totally wrong on this too, but it doesn't seem to push a lot of buttons. It just is more inviting to everybody
I mean, I think I don't know if it's K-pop, but I think obviously the big South Korean hit that probably people may have heard of is that song Gangnam Style,
Oh yeah, everybody loved
which
that. Yeah.
which was a show that, and actually, funny enough, it's the sort of show that the song that you could actually play, I guess, in an old people's home, and they could all sit around doing the exercises when they were doing that, or you could put it on at a kid's birthday party, and actually
Hmm.
they'd have fun dancing to it. And actually, it's quite a good representation, maybe, of what perhaps is South Korean genres at times, where there is
Right.
this accessibility to the music, which is quite interesting, but sometimes that broadness doesn't create this specification that you sometimes need from it
Right.
as a result.
And it's funny you mentioned that. Now that I think about that, when it became so huge, I remember people like would go and find the translation of it, and the guy Psy uh, wrote that as kind of a parody to write probably the worst song he could ever write, and it became this huge global phenomenon. And the lyrics are incredibly dirty, from what I understand. So, uh, so it was kind of an infiltrative joke on a lot of levels. But the funny thing that I think that about K-pop is it evolves very quickly as time goes on. It's a genre that has been able to blur language barriers in efforts to unite people of all tribes and nations. Often, when it's heard on American radio and streaming platforms, it's a mixture of both Korean and English languages. In fact, I think there was something I read where there was a boy band that was specifically designed to speak both Korean and Mandarin so it could start to improve relations amongst those cultures.
And I mean, actually, it's very important to just talk for a second about Korea's theatre economy, because without South Korea now, Broadway would be in a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
Their position in the global theatre scene is now more significant than Japan. Japan used to be the very big producer of a lot of Western musicals and different shows.
Yep.
South Korea's certainly taken that over. If you go to Seoul, its theatre land is largely as big as the West End.
Yeah.
And people like David Mamet, Arthur Miller are very big playwrights over there. The Mousetrap just had quite a successful production that's played over there. So you've got
Right.
quite traditional work. Alongside that, you've got sort of some of those rather crazy, rather bizarre South Korean shows where they sort of, I don't know, set up a show where they're set in a kitchen, like a sort of kitchen physical show, and they're all throwing knives at each other and that sort of thing. So you've got like complete extremes of different stuff, but they have got now a very burgeoning musical theatre economy, and
Yeah.
and certainly things like K-pop are quite an influence in some of the genre of that writing that's coming through as well. What's interesting, a lot of the K-pop stars have gone into these shows.
Oh yeah.
And so they've actually found this quite interesting fusion between pop and musical theatre, which has been very, very successful.
Well, that actually is a really nice transition into what I'm going to be talking about just next, because the whole K-pop thing is really just about how cool it is to be South Korean. That's the image we want to present, and that South Koreans can be cool anywhere, but that has a shelf life. They can maybe get to about 28 or 29, but then they can't be pop stars anymore. That's just kind of how this thing goes. I mean, it's the creation of the music itself is almost as important as the creation of the performers. And here's a longer quote I found from Vox on the history of the genre. Here we go. Quote, "Through highly competitive auditions starting around ages 10 to 12, music studios induct talented children into the K-pop regimen. The children attend special schools where they take specialized singing and dancing lessons. They learn how to moderate their public behavior and prepare for life as a pop star. They spend hours in daily rehearsals and perform in weekend music shows as well as special group performances. Through these performances, lucky kids can gain fan followings before they even officially, air quotes, debut. And when they're old enough, if they're really one of the lucky few, the studios will place them into an idol group or even occasionally launch them as a solo artist." End quote.
And also, there's a very important thing to understand here with these windows of time, is that there was national service still in South Korea.
Yes.
So
Yes.
you have a point where suddenly those young people will go off to do their national service, and effectively it can curtail suddenly a pop career.
Right.
It's quite an interesting moment. And when they come out of national service, obviously, they're effectively now living as adults. It's a sort of passage of moment where things have changed.
Right. And do you know how long that service is?
I believe it's 2 years, but I could
2 years, yeah.
I could be wrong on that. It's a year, certainly a year, or it might be a year, or it might be 2 years. And of course, I think there is a quite famous K-pop boy band where it's just famously one of the members has just gone off to do his national service. They were working out whether they were going to get an exemption because they've been quite globally successful, but
Oh,
actually the
wow.
government has said no, and I think he's just gone off to have his first national service, and then the other performers who are a bit younger than him will all have to go at certain points. So effectively, that band becomes redundant because if you're a
Yeah.
five-piece band and you're missing a member each time, you're either going to have to go out as solo artists, or possibly that will be the end of that group.
So, one of the more popular traits of a K-pop group is the outward appearance of assembling a dissociated and diverse group of, air quotes, characters all brought together by this style of music. So, you've got your prissy rich girls, and you've got your bad girls, and you've got, the tomboys or whatever, and they're all brought together and they're thrown into a group, and they all can do K-pop and the dance and stuff together. And speaking of that, plus, I just have to say the choreography is phenomenal. Somehow simultaneously fusing breakdancing, hip hop, and modern dance, it is synchronized dancing at its finest. And remember, these are often groups of musicians, and their dance numbers look as though they were all cloned from the same source, but are somehow different people. So, for the better part of the last 2 decades, K-pop has become part of any Korean child's upbringing to be an essential part of culture and decorum.
I mean, in some ways, it's rather nice that music brings all those people together.
Yeah.
Because actually there's this uniformity. And as you say, you're absolutely right. When you watch K-pop, if any people are listening who've never watched a K-pop performance, the dancing, I mean, just go on YouTube and just Google some of it.
Oh.
It is absolutely phenomenal. And you do say, how on earth can someone do that? Because it's incredible, and the physicality and the demand. I mean, you've got to have athletic ability to be able to deliver this, and the discipline to it is extraordinary. But of course, what is amazing is that you can watch a South Korean school playground and things like that, and the kids are also emulating these people. And what's rather nice is that music is bringing that community together and that accessibility. And I think that's something that's pretty fun. I think it's also interesting about the characters, because the characters are, in a way, they're a bit like sort of quite manga in a way, with the sort of comic style characters, because they've got sort of quite extreme, almost quite pantomimic types of characters.
As of 2018, the production of K-pop was a $5 billion industry. Here, I'm going to give you a couple more stats. I've got to mention them just because they're the ones. The biggest K-pop band out there right now is the boy band BTS. The group has broken so many sales records in just the last few years alone that their achievements are in the same league as global superstar musicians Michael Jackson and the Beatles. I love this one because I remembered seeing it in Sheridan, Wyoming. Beginning on May 26, 2021, McDonald's restaurants launched the BTS Happy Meal, which consisted of, quote, 10-piece chicken McNuggets, medium fries, and a medium Coke, complete with sweet chili and Cajun dipping sauces inspired by popular McDonald's South Korea recipes. This went live in 50 countries.
It's amazing. And I think BTS, it might be the group where I think the young man in that has just gone off.
That's the one. Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised.
I know there was a lot of tears from young fans in Korea. I can remember watching on the news when it was being announced,
I'm sure.
Floods of tears and so on. And I think the guy had gone and got quite floppy hair, and he's just had it all shaved off. So
oh no,
that all going on as he started his time, really.
So black market, you could get to that barber shop and sweep those up and put them in a bag.
Probably, I mean, there's probably someone who's already done that.
So, I mean, if I haven't painted enough of a picture of how big K-pop is in global culture, I'll give it this metaphor: if K-pop was a sport, it would be soccer, or as most of the rest of the world knows it, football. And I'll also use that metaphor to suggest just how popular it was worldwide in 2017. But had not yet been able to infiltrate American culture to the degree that it had almost everywhere else. So, okay, history aside, we know what K-pop is. Let's go back to 2017 and this New York Times review from Ben Brantley and the very appropriately named K-pop the Musical Experience. And just to be clear, I have never seen this production in any form. Richard, did you get to see this in any form at all?
I didn't.
No? Okay. So anything we're talking about is based on research and hearsay. Again, listeners, if you got to see it and I'm telling you something wrong, please let me know. As suggested in Brantley's opening to this review of the show, it was a multi-room, multi-level, immersive theater experience. Once an audience member was in the building, they are now considered with their ticket to be a talent scout, getting ready to promote and vote for the next big K-pop sensation, be it a group or an individual. So this show that's on display is the latest slew of offerings from the fictional JTM Entertainment, a K-pop production studio trying to make the next big acts that they'll be able to push onto American markets. The end result should be an experience of the art form from a number of perspectives, as it's something of a self-guided tour. And if you listen carefully, you'll pick up on a number of different narratives that you can follow from room to room, even though there's a full soundtrack and there's a full list of songs. You get to know the characters and you see how what they do in one room affects what they do in another room. Here are some of the characters you'd meet, and I bring these up just because the names are fun. Members of the 5-member boy band Fate, spelled F and the number 8, Fate. Members of the 6-member girl group Special K. Longtime favorite solo artist Mue, spelled MWE. The vocal coach Yasmin, the choreographer Jen, who both have the compassion of American drill sergeants. And this is a great one. I love that this is a main character in this whole thing. You get to meet Dr. Park, the company's in-house plastic surgeon.
Well, that's because, as you probably know, plastic surgery is a very big thing in South Korea.
Oh, yeah.
And it's actually to do with the Western nose, that a lot of young women look at that and think about the the surgery that happens, which is a shame because, I mean, South Korean people are very handsome and attractive people, but
absolutely.
That desire to sort of in some ways look at Western culture and things, it's prevalent in other Asian countries as well.
Right. So from this experience, on the positive side, the audience should see the incredible product with literally decades of work to be brought to this moment in the creation of this form of K-pop in front of you right now. On the negative side, the audience sees a show that, quote, also addressed themes of xenophobia, racism, and child labor, end quote. It was one of the most nominated theatrical performances of 2017, and it was obvious that because of that, the next step would be Broadway. And I'll tease this a bit, but it's also culturally significant in that when it made its big break to Broadway in 2022, it was the first musical on Broadway written by a female Asian composer. Helen Park wrote the music. Her writing partner, Max Vernon, wrote the lyrics, but the book was also written by an Asian artist, Jason Kim. And from what I understand, when it went to Broadway, it had this huge representation of Korean American, AAPI artists, both on stage and backstage and in the production team. So it was a really significant thing for Asian cultures to be able to put this up on Broadway.
It represents something quite important because, of course, we're going to an era now with Broadway, particularly coming out of BLM, which has made people stop and sort of think about diversity and representation of the arts and theatre in general. And of course, Broadway, I think, has seen a lot of that in this last season with a number of its productions that have been, coming on stage and giving new voice and new forces coming in who've been getting those opportunities to be embraced into the Broadway community in a way that they should be. And I think, here was a show that was actually quite important because obviously, Asian representation has at times not always been as strong as it should have been, or has been misguided. I mean, most famously with the Miss Saigon debacle, which of course began right back in, with Jonathan Pryce and what happened there at that particular point. And of course, David Henry Hwang wrote a very powerful play after that called Yellowface, which was an interesting play.
Yeah.
Explores that whole show with B.D. Wong, I think, who did the original production of that. And, so there's always been a underrepresentation on its stages. And, it was a very important show, I think, to have tried to address that in some ways with this.
Right.
Work.
Yeah. But I guess I'll have to suggest that in 2017, popularity of K-pop in American markets was not as popular. It was more of kind of convention level. You have your very, very serious fans who, when they hear that an event is getting close to them, they're going to throw, their entire schedule out the window and go.
You're looking at a tourist ticket, a lot of tourists come to New York. So your target audience possibly isn't entirely necessarily going for the American audience, or obviously you are going for an American Korean audience who you think will probably come.
Yeah.
You know, you've got a few challenges to work out where you are with the genre, because as I say,
Right.
I can listen to a few K-pop tracks, but I don't know whether I'd be able to sit down and listen to an entire album in one sitting necessarily.
See, and there's your, I read the first 25 pages and I'm
Yeah,
not hooked,
there's
right?
your question.
Yeah.
Although I have to say that you sit and watch some of that dancing, and you are captivated for that period
Oh
of
my
time.
God.
But
Yeah. Well, and the costuming and the hair and the light show,
Yeah.
and it is a huge spectacle to watch.
yeah, I mean, the trick with those shows almost is that they come at you so fast there isn't time to breathe.
Yeah.
That's sometimes, and I'm not saying that K-pop is that, but the speed of a show can be like, I'm just going to try and blindside you. So I'm
Yeah.
going to blindside you with all this. And actually, sometimes a lot of dance routines and things can actually mitigate what's the most important thing of a musical, which is its book. Because if you haven't got the foundation of the book there, then you're kind of scuppered to start with, really.
Yeah, I think we're heading into, okay, so from the off-Broadway huge hit, which had people coming back for multiple performances and cosplaying as characters in the show and attending several times, to its Broadway run, why did it close in 17 performances? I mean, honestly, the off-Broadway run was about 8 weeks long, but I mean, it was an immersive thing. Once you went to it, you've seen it, and I mean, you might get a different experience of it by going back several different times and maybe starting in a different room or taking a different path or something like that. But it's still, at the end of the night, you get kind of the same general idea. So from the 2017 off-Broadway product to the move to Broadway in 2021 that they attempted, but thank you, COVID, didn't allow that to happen. They got it ready for 2022. Here's the thing, though, that happened with the K-pop genre. It finally actually infiltrated American markets as far as music was concerned. So even in my little town of Sheridan, Wyoming, you could turn on the radio on your morning drive and hear K-pop music. I think the stat that I saw about BTS was on the Billboard Hot 100, they hit it 6 times in a year with a number one hit, which was faster than the Beatles.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's here. It's here. So,
but of course, the Beatles didn't have download.
And it sounds like YouTube helped that out a lot, because it was like, if you listen to one song, then it's the BTS music video is the next thing in your queue just by the suggestion. You should watch this. Yeah. So, yeah, there's this huge, massive change in how prolific K-pop had become. And then there was this huge world-changing event called COVID that reshaped how much of the world conducts business, and the theater world is no different. So an out-of-town tryout was planned in DC in 2021. COVID prevented it from happening. So they're like, heck, let's just take this right to Broadway. So they didn't get that out-of-town response that they might have otherwise gotten with this new script that they wrote. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. But the show opened, as we said, at the Circle in the Square Theater on November 27th, 2022, after 44 previews and a delayed opening due to another COVID outbreak in the cast. The show closed on December 11th after only 17 performances.
And it's not, if listeners know it, it's not the biggest theatre Circle in the Square either.
No, it's not.
So we're not talking about a large auditorium. It's actually quite a small house on one of the smallest, I think, almost, or one of them.
I'll just go ahead and declare it here. These are my takes on the big mistakes between 2017 and 2022, and you have hit on the very first one that I had. Staging at the Circle in the Square in a thrust setting. So for my listeners that don't know, Circle in the Square is generally designed to be in the round theater, and I looked it up. It's somewhere between 650 to 776 seats regularly for an in the round setting. And I don't know what the seating capacity was for K-pop, but they had to take one side of that house out to what they did was they made it more like a concert experience. So for my listeners who are unfamiliar with what a thrust setting is, it's where the audience is seated on 3 sides, but diminishing just how many seats you can have.
I mean, I have to say, just to Circle in the Square for a second, is that its thrust format's not uncommon. So Oklahoma played in that format.
Right.
The Rocky Horror Show that was there for a couple of years played in that. I have a feeling, I can't remember if Once on This Island did or didn't in that format. So it's not an uncommon shape for them to play in. But for dance, the things when I've watched K-pop on stage and it being performed it actually needs quite a wide stage, and I think it's actually best served end on, to be honest.
I think that was one of the creative decisions that was made, where they went, let's try to make it more like a concert experience, which the Broadway audience might not be wanting to see. They might be wanting that fairly traditional audience sits on one side, performance happens on the other.
You also got up against another very, very big dance-heavy show at the moment on Broadway, which is MJ the Musical.
Yep.
Which is just playing around the corner, which if you go in and see that show, it's literally from the second they push the button till when it stops, it is non-stop dance. I mean, it's directed by a choreographer, so it doesn't, I mean, we're talking about shows not letting go, and that show is really a 2-hour big dance concert extravaganza, really. You don't have masses about Michael Jackson's life in that show. It's really about him preparing to do the performance of Thriller.
Yeah.
That he is in the rehearsal studio rehearsing it, but it is pulsating to watch with the dance. So immediately, big end on space, and you've got K-pop kind of playing a little bit as its sort of second cousin to that, really, in a way, being in a slightly smaller theater.
Well, I mean, when you think about it, there are a couple of questions I bring up with that, but one, as it relates to MJ, you've got American audiences who know Michael Jackson more.
Yeah, but also the other difference, we come back to the same thing, is you'd probably be quite happy to listen to an evening of Michael Jackson's hits because of the variation to them. K-pop, as I say, it is quite unrelenting when you listen to it. So in a sense, you have to be prepared that that's your night. And in a way, MJ works because it stems in a lot of different generations because his music's gone through so many years.
Right.
Whereas we're still dealing with what's a comparatively new genre of music with K-pop, and that's gonna present still a minority audience in some ways to its listenership.
Right.
But I have to say, K-pop probably will have had, some additional costs because Circle and Square is indeed a Broadway house.
Yeah, yeah.
The reason they want to be on a Broadway house is it'll make them eligible for the Tony Awards.
Yep.
And I would think, based on the show, there is a very good chance, even regardless of its short appearance, that it could get a nomination in choreography.
I would suggest that. I would suggest the costuming. We'll talk about it later, but it is primarily spectacle. So you've got huge sound, huge lights. The music is run by like 3 people pressing buttons on a board. So
here we sit with an important point about a lot of these shows that come along. Let's just take a moment to just reflect on probably one of the most produced composers on Broadway, who's had probably more flops than anyone on Broadway that one can think of, which is Frank Wildhorn.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
And Frank Wildhorn of Jekyll and Hyde and Wonderland and, Scarlet Pimpernel and all of those shows is consistently produced on Broadway. And yet a large number of those shows have failed. Jekyll and Hyde had a bit more of a run. And of course, we have to thank Frank Wildhorn because in a sense, it's what gave David Hasselhoff his career again, because he came back and of course starred in Broadway. But parking all of that to one side, these shows open, they don't run. But Wildhorn is now probably the biggest Western composer in a large part of Europe and if not Asia. So, Jekyll and Hyde, enormous hit in Korea and Japan. You go across Germany, Frank Wildhorn's musicals are widely produced before the Russian Federation war with Ukraine.
Yep.
Massive in Russia. He has written strategically now for countries where he hasn't even premiered in the US with work. Therefore, why come to Broadway and put a show on for it to flop? Well, the fact about it is, it's actually regardless of that, because actually you can lift that and say it's come direct from Broadway. The flop part doesn't matter. His name is a strong element to that. Maybe he might pick up a Tony somewhere. Maybe it might get an orchestration Tony or something that they can put, the Tony nominated musical. All of that sells in another territory. So why we're saying that the Tony Award becomes important for them to be doing K-pop on Broadway as opposed to, say, doing it in an off-Broadway house is that if, as we think that show probably will have with K-pop, a very large audience in South Korea, which will probably recoup all its money back that it lost on Broadway, and indeed other Asian markets where it goes to and indeed elsewhere, if it gets a Tony nomination now for choreography, maybe it might even win it if the choreography is that fantastic.
Right.
But to actually see that as a marketing exercise on a poster becomes a very strong carrot in a lot of other places, because Broadway still has the stamp of this show has been on Broadway. The flop doesn't suddenly start to come into it, because the brand is actually what's the, and in all honesty, a Ben Brantley review or a negative review of the New York Times, this audience isn't reading that paper.
No, they're not. No.
They're influenced by what other people say. So, if there is a pocket of K-pop fans who come out and say, this is celebrity K-pop fans who say this is the best thing I've ever seen, they're going to be more drawn to that than anything else. We're in an interesting zone, because then you start to say, well, is Broadway therefore just serving as a bit of a sort of branding tool to move it somewhere else?
It's just a springboard. Yeah.
But they're not the first to do it. As I say, let's go back to Frank Wildhorn's musicals and look to the fact of how many go. Why do they happen? But then look at how they're licensed over the world. And if you've been the producer who's put that show up, don't forget you're probably then owning the licensing rights as the originating producer afterwards. So after that, you're going to be collecting a nice royalty for quite a good number of years. You've probably got royalties coming back on cast recordings and all sorts of stuff. And so, Frank Wildhorn has made a lot of money for a lot of Broadway investors and people, even if their venture onto Broadway itself has possibly flopped. And I think with K-pop, we will see probably the similar thing replicated.
Oh, I'm definitely expecting it to pop up in other markets. Obviously, going back to like a homecoming tour in Seoul. Yeah.
So it's not a flop. The interesting thing about this is it's an exercise into the next territory that you take it to.
Well, I mean, the way that you're saying it, like the next several points I might bring up almost might be moot, but it almost is like they set up a plan A, which is obviously a successful long-time Broadway run, but our plan B is all of these other markets who are probably going to enjoy it.
Yes.
Well, would any of us have thought of that? A Broadway run could have been just another step to financial success, whether it worked out on Broadway or not. Whew. There's a lot more to unwrap here, and Richard gives me a lot more wonderful ideas to mull over, so stick with us. But as you're listening to the rest, go check out our Instagram feeds. Both Trident Theater and Euripides Humanities have their own pages. Plus, I have links to everything on Trident's website, tridenttheater.com. Oh, and don't forget, I spelled theater with a T-R-E at the end. Connect with me. I'd love to hear from you. Oh, and rate and review this show wherever you're listening. It really does help the show out. Speaking of the show, let's get back to it. The conclusion of the postmortem of K-pop the musical. Well, okay, so I'll get to my next point. After what we just said here, we've got some very practical business reasons why it might have been an acceptable loss. But coming from let's contribute to the world of Broadway and the world theater market, the next point I would say is the move from being an immersive project to a traditional theater project. It's kind of difficult to retain that magic, in my opinion.
Yeah. It's certainly a very interesting and unusual transition to be making.
Yeah.
That you think that maybe actually you'd want to sort of just scrap that project and say we've done that, so now we're going to set it up in a different way. So it's almost like I've got to go back to the drawing board, and it's almost like two different entities that go on. It feels a bit like you're trying to fit a square pin in a round plug in some ways.
Yes.
We're trying to do that. So that's unusual, but it does make it feel in some ways like it's coming to it with people who perhaps from a genre that are not as experienced in putting musical theater on.
Yeah. I would say they were all pretty new as far as the Broadway market. They were deeply immersed in musical theater.
The danger is they can all then become like they're experts. And that's also dangerous because, it's not to say this is what happened, but you can look at what is the brand and be fairly confident that you're going to have a hit.
Yeah.
And actually, you can start to say, well, maybe the story, this bit of the book's not so important, or it doesn't. And actually, the storyline becomes a bit silly, perhaps.
Well, I just think of the individual effect of that immersive theater project and why people would come back again and again and again. And taking it directly to Broadway, they took a lot of that individual element out of it and tried to shoehorn an individual experience into a group experience. So what happened with this, this might be another thing where people correct me, but what it sounds like is when you went to Broadway and you got your ticket, you were given a wristband. It's one of two colors, and you were now divided into two different scouting teams. So instead of being an individual scout on your own, now you're part of a team and you get to vote. It's very similar to like, Britain's Got Talent or something like that. And maybe we'll get this team up to the next level. And it's all written, so it's going to go in a certain way anyway. But yeah, it was just a different method of communication between the audience and the performers. So I think it was a fairly, I hesitate the word ingenious method of moving an immersive experience into a more traditional experience, but I just think some of that magic was lost.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And and sometimes you can end up in those elements trying a bit too hard. And actually they can feel a bit weak. The elements that were quite special don't suddenly match up, because I mean, obviously the part of an immersive experience is the fact that it's this immersive thing going on around you.
Yes.
So when you're so catapulted into this, it can sometimes mask some of the other flaws because you're so zoned out by what you're watching, what's just going on around you.
Yeah.
And you know, if it's moving at, as it sounds, a reasonable pace, even as an immersive show, you perhaps don't notice those flaws. When you're sat in the show, you're going to realize probably very quickly within the first 5-6 minutes whether you're going to enjoy this show. And, you know, 10 minutes in, if the book's not going anywhere, you're going to be looking at your watch saying, oh, how much longer is there to go on with this possibly? And, you know, it's not transitioning. Whereas if you think about an immersive show, you're transitioning through it all the time. So if you don't like this moment, you're moving on to something else. But actually, in a way, with an immersive show, you're sort of yourself in charge of your own destiny.
Yeah. Yes.
Inside a theater, you're giving someone else the map, and you're following it, and you're taking the route, and you're going where they take you. But you are captive in a way that's not necessarily the same in an immersive show. I mean, immersive shows are very difficult to get right. I've done a few of them myself, and you know how you navigate a show and how you guide it through. They're the hardest things to succeed and make work.
Right.
But you constantly have a constant flow through an immersive show. When you translate that idea into a theatre, by its very nature of being sat there watching, you have not created the environment. So suddenly, every weakness that's on that stage that isn't so strong is going to show up.
Yeah.
The voting, it sounds interesting, but again, it sounds like it could become quite repetitive. It sounds like something that's quite fun to do maybe once, but once you've done it maybe a few times, it doesn't have the same level of excitement. And also, you've got to really get the pace going with that, because you could also slow the whole journey down with it, you know.
Right.
You have to stop to take the votes and do it again, and you know, all that sort of thing, really. You know, I think you've got to be careful with gimmicks, because gimmicks can get too carried away, you know. I mean, it's like that famous show years ago. It was a movie, actually, wasn't it? Which they had. You remember those things in America where you used to be able to rip off and you could sniff something, and they were like sniff cards.
Oh, scratch and sniff, yeah.
Scratch and sniff, yeah. So there was a guy who tried to perfect that as a movie years ago, in I think the 70s. He had the idea that he
I remember
scratch and sniff at the cinema, and so they'd have a sequence, and then you know, do it up and down. But it was, of course, an unmitigated disaster, because people just didn't want to go and watch a movie where they were having to do that. They wanted to just sit and watch a movie and be entertained, and not have to do it. So it was a totally different thing. It didn't correlate, and possibly again taking an immersive idea or asking audiences and then translating it into a theater, it doesn't always work in that same way.
No. And I can see it where they're like, you know, the original one was kind of the precursor to the big show that we're going to do, and it didn't. Here's the other element, though. When you go from the off-Broadway one in 2017 to the Broadway version in 2022, like I said early on in this, the genre evolves, and it evolves quickly. So in 5 years, even through the pandemic, they had to write new songs to match what the genre was doing, but they were still doing it with the same old characters from 5 years ago. So if you talk about it in perspective of history, and there are a lot of things that, yes, we'd have to take into consideration with this, but, you know, you have people like Elvis Presley and the Beatles performing music at the same time. But before the Beatles were popular, Elvis was popular. So it's kind of like asking Elvis to now sing Beatles songs.
Yeah.
And that doesn't really work.
It's also holding on to things that you thought worked quite well in the immersive show, and saying, wow, people really love that, so we better keep this for the main version. I remember there's an expectation that you think people who went to the immersive show will now come and see it on Broadway, and those are the things they really loved, so we need to make sure we keep those because they worked. But you're dealing with different contexts as well of where things work and why things work and all that sort of stuff. I don't know if an out-of-town tryout would have helped this show or not, though, because it's hard to know and gauge how you test that. What it might have done is it might have taught them a lot about the space. But the out-of-town tryout probably would not have been in a 3-sided auditorium. It would have been in an end-on theatre somewhere. I mean, it feels in many ways that the show needs to be in a big space because the genre feels quite big. And you know, when you watch these routines, they really are, you know, full on and massive.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing you have to think about with this presence of this show on Broadway is this is not a bridge and tunnel show, whereas actually MJ the musical is. So again, you have those bridge and tunnel audience who will come in because they want to see this. Whereas K-pop is actually quite a hard sell into some of those markets because,
Yeah.
you know, you might have a bunch of kids who really love it. But if you're going to come on your bridge and tunnel visit and you're going to bring grandma and you're going to bring, you know, family over to watch their Broadway show, is K-pop going to be on the list of that one that you're going to choose? You might well opt for something where people feel more familiar with the genre and the music, because the
Oh,
thing I would
this.
say about K-pop is you do actually have to watch or listen to quite a lot of it to try and find the bits that you connect with, because
Yes.
there's such a random hodgepodge to me of different stuff that's going on. You actually eventually have to find the artist that kind of sort of you embrace, and you sort of like, it's not like discovering a recording artist like this and I love the Beatles or I love Eric Clapton or I like this and that's the artist I want to follow.
Right.
Because as you were saying, it's so transient, this music, that
Hmm.
actually it's quite, I mean, BTS is interesting because they've established, you know, you can see why people follow that recording group, but it's actually quite unusual like that, because you really have this sort of constant stream because there's so much product being driven at you all the time,
Yeah.
and it's a very different style of manufactured music in contrast to someone like the Beatles, who were often making and writing their own music, of course, and doing that sort of
Right.
thing. These are
Right.
actually quite manufactured songs, a lot of them.
Completely
And
manufactured.
you know, you're sitting
Yeah.
there saying, actually, it's like a factory that's turning this out.
Hmm.
And as I say, that's going to appeal to some people. It's not going to appeal to others. But if you're going to spend your $100 to come to Broadway and you're coming on a family trip, there's
Yeah.
probably other shows where you say, actually, this might actually serve all our family party than just maybe a couple of kids who really love the street dance elements of it.
Well, and that was something that when the book writer, the writers, and the director and the producers, when they were asked, so what do you think happened here? And one of the things they said was, nobody knows this. I mean, you know, we've just come out of this huge pandemic and people are going to things that are familiar. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, you've got, at the same time, you've got Music Man, you've got Hamilton, you've got Book of Mormon, you've got Wicked, you've got Lion King. All of these are still running at the same
I
time.
think the most interesting thing is, if you look, because I've been following it quite closely, is the theatrical index, which you get each week with the weekly sales figures of shows.
Mhm.
So it's just changed slightly, and it's a big loss because, of course, Music Man's just dropped off the grid, which was
Right.
turning in, and that was consistently the number one show on Broadway.
Mhm.
But look at this: number one show on Broadway was Music Man. It was turning in about 3 million a week. Okay.
Yeah.
Following after that, the number two show has been The Phantom of the Opera, which is extraordinary. The number three show, I think, quite frequently has sat there and been often Lion King.
Yeah.
Wicked has appeared quite regularly in there, and
Mhm.
Funny Girl.
Funny Girl.
Funny Girl has popped up, you know, week to week quite often. Leah Michelle is a draw on the ticket, but we are talking about no new musical of the
Right.
last decade or so.
Right.
You know, Hamilton,
Mhm.
of course. That's the only one that I would say
Yeah,
is, of course,
right.
there as well.
Yeah.
That's been on the grid, and obviously is a later musical. But we're not talking, when we look at it, we're looking at audience. Okay, so look at the audience pattern here. They're going for the familiar stock classics.
Yep.
And the fact that Phantom of the Opera, when it announced it was closing, which had some rough weeks before then, suddenly catapults and has stayed consistently in the number two position on Broadway, makes you realize that that audience is actually being quite select in where they want to spend their money and what
Mhm.
they're choosing to go and see. I mean, the fact that, you know, $1 million differences between Phantom in number two and Music Man consistently in number one certainly suggests that, you know, the departure of Music Man leaves quite a big hole on Broadway.
Yeah.
Broadway at the minute, I think, probably does need that big new original hit, and so
Yeah.
does the West End. You know, it's the
Mhm.
sort of hit where people, you know, when Phantom of the Opera exploded in the West End and on Broadway, people camped outside the theatre every day with returns lines all day long, queuing for tickets. Every person, even if they didn't go to the theatre very often, knew about the Phantom of the Opera. They heard of that show. It was in the news
Yep.
everywhere. In a way, recovery now of Broadway, the West End, it kind of needs that sort of show to sort of come and be an original hit and score some attention. If we've got a chance of building a future for the Broadway industry, but it means that a show like K-pop comes at it in quite a difficult scenario, because it's got to dent itself onto Broadway, make a mark, get going. It's fighting against other big hitters. Where does K-pop find its audience? And if all these other large shows are fighting for that ticket, and we're talking about old familiar shows, which are not necessarily all of them doing the business that they may have once done, and they're
Right.
in a fight to secure that. You are in a marketplace, and don't forget, what you've got is 650 seats.
Yep.
You haven't got the same level of break figure that you're trying to hit. So maybe your marketing spend things is perhaps not as big as something like Disney can throw at it or behind it, and it's not as established in the same way. And in a way, it's more specialist in its brand and its market. So you come to it with quite a lot of challenges.
So that actually brings me, I'm going to flip a couple of my points that I think might have been interesting talking points. And the producers, the book writer, the director, they all kind of said, I'm not sure we got the marketing right, because they said, we reached out to Asian communities and Korean communities and tried to engage them. But from what they were saying, it seemed like the marketing from a visual perspective just more resembled a K-pop concert rather than a big Broadway show.
I think that's true. And I think there's another strand to it, which is incredibly confusing to some audiences who don't know the genre, which is they see South Korean music and therefore think it's being performed in the Korean language.
Yes.
Sometimes people might associate K-pop again as a non-English language show,
right?
On Broadway, and they haven't understood that. So
right.
when they're looking, they're not sure or they're not confident because that's not been made clear to them in the decision of marketing and branding as well.
Well, and there were a couple of other things that were kind of backlash against that. There were some suggestions that said, "Hey, look, we just got to be honest here. A lot of Broadway is marketed to an older, whiter audience, and we don't know how to infiltrate a younger Asian audience."
Yeah, I think that's a very true and clear statement. And also, it's expensive for a younger person to spend to come and buy
oh my God,
buy a
yeah.
ticket.
I didn't even see the prices on the tickets, but I mean, I'm looking at tickets this summer. I'm planning on taking my partner and my boys, and we're like, okay, so we're going to have to just go ahead and get ready for $400 on a show. That's just what we got to do. And I mean, we're ready to do it, but not everybody is ready to just put that down for a non-established, not an adaptation, completely fully original musical, not a revival.
And I think, younger people haven't necessarily got always that disposable income. The older audience, who are the people who will read the New York Times review and don't think it's for them anyway, are not gonna bother. I mean, they will go if it's Hamilton, and say, I'll take a risk on rap and hip hop because we've been told in the paper now that this is good.
Yes.
So that audience does have some effect by what the papers possibly say in this. It's different to if it was a Beatles musical or if it was a Queen We Will Rock You musical, because there is a genre of music that they know, and obviously those recording artists or radio DJs who can come and say it's fantastic, they'll listen to. K-pop is actually taking a step into the unknown here, so actually they will look and see what the New York Times suddenly says about it. The younger audience, less so, of course, but the other challenge with younger audiences is that they do not book in advance.
No, they're walk up.
So you end up in a quite lastminute.com kind of culture, which from a producing standpoint is terrifying, because you never know then from week to week where you're sitting with your advanced box office.
Right.
But the culture has shifted as well in a way of booking, and of course the problem you have now with things like COVID, I think that continues even more so, because do people want to wait because if they're not well, or they decide that things might change, or a show might, if they came to Broadway the last time and the two shows they were going to both got cancelled because the cast were off sick with COVID, you might decide that you're not going to take the chance to book as far in advance again, unless you've got Hugh Jackman in the show and you can say, well, that's going to be a ticket.
That's going to be worth my time.
As I better pay my $100 for that, and then maybe I'll try and see some other stuff on discount.
Well, here's an interesting thing that you just kind of brought up, is that for the Broadway run, they had at least 3 internationally known K-pop big stars performing in the show. One of them being, her name is Luna. It was a very neat part about this very talented female solo artist who was getting closer to 30 and starting to realize, am I now becoming irrelevant? And so, I mean, neat storyline, but if it says featuring star, name I don't know, I'd be like, well, I guess that's good for them.
Yeah, but you're immediately having to explain probably who these people are to someone.
Yep.
And that's hard as well, because you want recognition. You want that facial recognition so people know instantly who they are.
Yeah.
And the thing, what you're dealing with here is that probably for a lot of K-pop fans, they may not necessarily be picking up Broadway leaflets or Broadway posters or looking at, Broadway listings in the same way as some of us might, or be on playbill.com and things.
Right.
So you're going to have to market into a music arena as to where these artists are appearing. And then you have another question is, let's take her as a very successful recording artist playing a character, but she's still touring and she's still performing.
Yeah.
So then you say, do I want to pay my $100 to go and watch Luna in a musical, which I might go and see, or do I want to go and actually see Luna, who's the pop star I like, playing live, and she's doing, sake of argument,
her
Madison
own songs,
Square Gardens or
Yeah.
something in her own songs in 10 months time or something like that.
Right.
So maybe if you're a diehard Luna fan, you'll go and see the K-pop show once.
Right.
But you might not go and see it a second time, because actually, if you're a diehard fan who likes her music, you might like to go and see her as an artist live doing her songs, which
Right.
comes to a particular golden rule about when you ever produce a jukebox show. If you produce a jukebox show, you either need to pick a band that doesn't tour very much or is dead. Because the simple reason being is you can go through the jukebox genre,
Yep.
and see the majority of the time the most successful jukebox shows of all time. Okay, so Buddy the Musical ran for years in the West End. The only place you could hear Buddy Holly's songs being performed on stage was the show. Mamma Mia. Okay, well, ABBA doesn't play very much or tour anymore, so the only place you could see it, other than maybe going to see some sort of tribute act that was going on, was the endorsed Beyond and Benny ABBA musical that was playing in the West End.
Yep.
We Will Rock You. When We Will Rock You opened, Queen and Freddie Mercury, dead, but Freddie Mercury and Queen were not touring anymore. So the only place you could see We Will Rock You was on the stage of that theatre. The Jersey Boys.
Yep.
Frankie Valli and the Jersey Boys do not tour anymore. So the only place you could see Frankie Valli and the Jersey Boys telling their story at the theatre. So the answer is, if you put a jukebox show on and the band is still very active and alive and touring and doing stuff, if you are a fan of that music, you want to see the band.
Yes.
You will go once, but you're not going to be, which is the all-important thing for any Broadway or West End musical, a repeat attender.
Yes.
So if you take K-pop and you take Luna, that's great. You'll probably go and see Luna once, twice, maybe, if you're lucky. But your actual desire is, because you like Luna, you want to hear Luna doing Luna songs.
Yeah.
So when Luna's next performing, that's what you want to spend your $100 on going to see. And it's probably the same with any of the other big K-pop stars that were appearing in that show.
That's amazing. Okay. So I got to go back to something we talked about just a moment ago, where it was a problematic thing that for a regular Broadway person to attempt to go to something that they didn't really have their heart set on, they're going to a review, right? If it's in the paper and they say it's good, I'll go to see that, even though it's not my style of music or whatever.
Yeah.
I suppose you heard about the New York Times review and Jesse Green's review that had some questionable word choices. Have you heard about this?
No, tell me a little bit more about it. I was aware that something came, but I don't know an awful lot about the review.
Well, there was one thing that you mentioned that Jesse Green suggested something like you need to be bilingual to understand the show, which was not true. The entire plot, every bit of it, was spoken in English. As with K-pop tunes, there was Korean infused into the lyrics, but not necessarily the lyrics are not the heart of a K-pop song. Okay, you're not going for the poetry. You're going for the dance, the spectacle, the fun, and the fact that they can sing actually pretty well. I mean, Luna has been noted to, her high notes are extraordinary. Yeah. But that is another thing that kind of drove people away. Another problem, though, was Green referred to the lighting design as squint-inducing. Yeah, the producers took some offense to that, saying, look, there is some inherent racism in calling a show's lighting design a show about Korean musical artists, and you're referring to something as squinting. That is problematic. And the producers actually released an open letter that I think was published at least in Playbill, that they demanded that the New York Times issue some sort of an apology because of that. New York Times responded, we didn't see any kind of racism in that. We're not going to do that.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think if you've got any chance of getting an older audience who might come and take a chance on seeing K-pop, you've basically just killed it by those remarks.
Well, and the fact that there was a controversy back and forth, that they had a review, they fought the review, and that the review, they just went, no, we're not going to overturn this.
It's an unfortunate choice of language. And you would hope that, the critic might have thought a little differently by what they were saying. It's interesting. The New York Times just, knocked it off and said, no, we're not interested.
I mean, they were very careful with their language and the response and everything, but they said, I think what you're seeing is not what we're seeing. So, yeah, there will be no apology issue.
And also they might be saying, well, clearly this show has got a bad notice and this is sour grapes over a bad review.
Yeah.
And, it doesn't necessarily carry the same merit. It's also interesting as to who is sometimes in those situations, making the complaint. If it's Cameron McIntosh or it's big heavyweights circling in, then you might suddenly be jumping up and responding slightly differently. But here we've had a show that across the board it sounds has not received very good notices, and it's a sort of sour grapes of something that's not very good to start with.
Well, it did in 2017. It got some amazing reviews with the immersive show. So here's my final point that I'm going to bring up that I think is probably one of the biggest deals in why it didn't get better reviews, hence didn't drive the tentative crowd. Changing the script between the 2017 and the 2022 unfortunately changed some of the essential elements of the K-pop genre that made the story more compelling, mainly that pressure to be a K-pop musician. In the 2017 version, they really heavily addressed the ideas of maintaining public decorum, maintaining a social media presence, the years of training it takes to make it to the top. This is one incredibly unfortunate thing that is a dark side of K-pop that we don't really hear about too much, is the rate of suicide. It's estimated that somewhere around 30% of all South Koreans suffer from a mental illness, but roughly half of them seek treatment. But particularly in the world of K-pop, the years of pressure leading up to eventual stardom or possible stardom, I mean, you can be picked off anywhere along the process and be like, you are not going to fit the mold that we are presenting, so you're out. But if you actually make it, the pressure to maintain it is so great that it's almost unbearable. I mean, I talked about this a few episodes ago with Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller, and how a lot of her self-confidence or her issues in self-confidence came from the fact that she was Marilyn Monroe. She was an icon and a self-aware icon. The difficulty of maintaining that was so world-breaking. I mean, she felt like Atlas all the time. But there have been several prolific figures just over the last several years in the world of K-pop who have taken their own lives for various reasons, but all related to the pressure of being in that industry. I mean, just living a lot in Korean culture. I had a friend who in his 20s, so 20 years ago, taught English in Korea. And he said he came out of a market one day, and it was underneath an apartment high-rise, and a young girl just fell to the street in front of him. She jumped from a window. And when he started asking around, they're like, yeah, this kind of actually happens a lot.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think there's a couple of things that are worthy of pausing. The first thing is to consider, the history of South Korea. You think back to the war that happened, not that many decades ago, when you think about it, and how the country was, obliterated. Seoul was obliterated. When you visit Seoul now, it is the most amazing high-tech city, and the way it's built its way back is quite extraordinary. But the little I know from my experience of working with Korea, there was a few things that interested me. Is that it's a country that, and you see this with certain communities, there's a lot of pride in their work and in what they do and how they deliver it. Mm-hmm. So sometimes on a show where something isn't fixed or it's not working, it can sort of become a bigger problem than when you realize it, because they've been trying to fix it and they haven't wanted to have the embarrassment of telling you it's not working.
Yeah.
Whereas actually to come and ask for help and talk to you about help would actually solve the problem so much sooner than
Right.
possibly the problem that you were dealing with.
Yeah.
Maybe you could translate that into a sort of lifestyle of mental well-being as well, and juxtapose that in a certain way. So there is an exorbitant amount of pressure of this responsibility and pride of delivery, where you don't
Yeah.
admit necessarily that admission that something's not going so well or you're not feeling so great. The other element that I would say, it's an important thing actually I found in Korea, which I was being told about by a Korean colleague when I was there, was crying is seen as something quite shocking in Korea.
Oh.
It's quite a shocking thing to see, especially when a man cries.
Oh yeah.
And I went to watch a production of Death of a Salesman in Korea, performed by a Korean cast, and I was actually with some international colleagues who I was very annoyed with, actually, because some of them were rather arrogant about the production they watched and what they saw. They didn't get the power of it in a way, and it was partly because of one particular moment that happened in it, which was that the actor himself, playing Willie Loman, cried on stage in quite a big way, and the audience watching this, who were Korean, were absolutely shocked by it. And of course, it's because they're not confronted usually with an older man on stage, Korean man, crying. And a lot of them didn't know how to deal with this. Now, some of the colleagues who were with me, Western colleagues, were rather arrogant about this and sort of, way it was being delivered and performed. And I said to them, you don't realize how important this moment is, what this culture represents. And this is an absolutely shocking moment for these people to be watching this moment in the play. And actually, I think, probably created quite a visceral moment in the culture for what they were watching at that particular minute.
Right. Yeah.
But it also says an awful lot about the society. I mean, one of the most shocking things I found in Korean television was on their Saturday primetime shows. They have to have a game show on a Saturday, and they break the game show often in the middle, where you have a family that are making an appeal because they're living in South Korea and they've not seen their son or their daughter or their family member because they're in North Korea. And they're doing this sort of thing, and it's a big prime time moment that happens. So you'll have Saturday night prime time suddenly gets stopped for this appeal that happens in their main shows. And when you watch it, it's quite a shocking thing to take in and watch, because you do realize that there's this present danger that sits there, and this structure. I mean, I have to say the whole thing of going to the border, because you can actually get very close in Seoul. It's only 20 minutes away. Some people who visited Korea might know this. There's an area called the Joint Security Area, and it's literally there's a border, and you can look over about 5 miles, and the other side is North Korea. And it's only about 20 minutes from Seoul. But when you go down there, the most extraordinary thing about it is that it's a bit of a tourist attraction. So they've got like merry-go-rounds and some fun fair amusement things. And you can't take a photograph at the fence, but you can stand 10 feet back and then take a photo if you want. But they've got like viewing cameras, like binocular things you can.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So
to look through and watch this stuff. And you've got soldiers standing there looking and observing stuff. You've got all of this side of things going on, and you're there as a Western tourist, effectively, sort of looking at it. But you've also got Koreans who've gone down there for a day down there as well. But you are also realizing that on the other side is this country, and the land between these two areas is completely, laid out with landmines. Of course, it's quite a dark side, but I mean, they're not alone in that. I think there's other Asian cultures that have quite strong suicide rates and things, by the nature of that and the pressure that people put on themselves.
Yeah. Well, I'll try to flip that coin and make it a little bit more positive here. But I think, I mean, from a storytelling perspective, if that gravitas could have been told in the Broadway adaptation, we might have had a little bit more. I wonder if the reviews would have been a bit better. But what I will say is that when Seoul got to host the 2018 Winter Olympics, everybody got a taste of K-pop. everybody the world over who was watching it. They watched their team come, enter into the Grand March at the beginning and everything, and a K-pop song accompanied them for every team. So everybody got immersed. People the world over, they're into it. Maybe it's just not a Broadway thing.
It's quite possible. And I mean, I'd say actually, if you want to get a taste of Korean culture, actually, is actually to look at how exciting their movie scene is at the moment. Because there's some fantastic Korean movies coming out, and it's a very different. I mean, people sort of now think of South Korea, and they all say, "Oh, Gangnam Style," all that music. Now look beyond that, because actually some of the writing, the script writing that's coming out of, particularly in their movie industry, is extraordinary at the moment in Korea. And so I think, aside of K-pop not biting on Broadway, I think one has to look to South Korea and recognize that as artists, there is a very exciting genre coming out in different fusions in that country. K-pop is one facet of actually a country that's incredibly diverse in its culture and its writing. There is a hunger to work and succeed and be the best that they can be. And I think, I think in terms of it is a tip of the iceberg at the minute, but I think South Korea will continue to be quite a major player now in the arts scene globally, actually.
I agree. I mean, when Parasite won Best Everything several years ago at the Oscars, and the director said, if you just get over the idea that you have to read the two little white lines at the bottom, you're going to allow yourself to enjoy a lot more things.
And I think that's the important thing. As I say, so don't base, I guess, an entire country on one $5 billion global enterprise. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on inside that country.
Richard and I continued our conversation for quite a while, wondering what would have been more successful for a K-pop musical. Should it now go to Vegas? What about an arena tour show? Should it have released a cast album first? Maybe so. What we were most surprised about was that even though neither of us had seen it, we found ourselves talking about a K-pop musical for a full 2 hours. But fortunately for you, you got the best parts of it. I want to thank Richard Jordan again for being my guest on this episode, and I wish him many broken legs as he heads to Australia for the next several weeks to put up another show. But in the meantime, this is Aaron Odom from Trident Theater in Sheridan, Wyoming, signing off for another episode of Euripides Eumenides, a Theater History podcast. I'll get another episode out to you in another 2 weeks, and I'll see you at intermission.